Joining us is Michael Brooks. He co-hosts The Majority Report with Sam Seder. And he also hosts The Michael Brooks Show, which goes live on YouTube every Tuesday night. You can find out how to become a Patreon supporter of The Michael Brooks Show by going to patreon.com/TMBS. TMBS stands for The Michael Brooks Show. He will also be doing a live rendition or iteration, depending on how pretentious you want to be. He'll be doing The Michael Brooks Show at the Bell House live February 1st. Go out and see him and become a patron of this show because it's the best. Whenever people tell me they enjoy my show, I thank them, and then I say, but you do listen to The Majority Report with Sam Seder and Michael Brooks, don't you? And you do listen to The Michael Brooks Show because that's much more important than what I'm doing here. You guys created a real think tank over there in Brooklyn. It's impressive. How many people do you surround yourself with each day to produce that show?
To produce The Majority Report, we're a team of 5 people.
Your show, how many people produce that show?
And these are both including myself, between basically 3 and 4 people. Basically about 3 people in studio, and then we have a guy, producer David Slavic, who's off site, who helps put it together.
And it takes a good week to produce the Michael Brooks Show because you're doing real research. You're not flying by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, and also, it's also there's 2 additional Patreon shows that go out, and one of those series is called Illicit Histories, where sort of they're more structured and they focus on a specific topic like Silicon Valley fascism or, what to learn from the Jesse Jackson presidential campaign or CIA in Jamaica. I mean, we've done so many at this point that I know I'm forgetting a huge amount, but those are really research heavy, and we're trying to tell like very specific stories. But, in both cases, I know that we get really, really good guests. And in my case, on Michael Brooks' show, I kind of have, I would say, anywhere from regular new really good guests, but probably something like 10 or 12 kind of roving regulars. Mm-hmm. And I'm really lucky. I mean, that's everybody from like Matt Taibbi,
wow,
who's a great journalist who everybody knows, to even a guy like who actually, I mean, some people know more so if they're in the international relations world, but like Mike Hanna, who's this kind of legendary South African journalist. He used to be the CNN Jerusalem bureau chief. Now he's at Al Jazeera, English primarily, and he does regular segments with me on the show. So it's also just been basically just having a great network and team and assembly of people that are ready to do stuff with you. And and like this Friday, you're coming on Majority Report with me. I mean, we have access to a lot of funny, smart, engaging people, and I'm a synthesizer. I want like everybody from the I'm starting to have actually more comics on my show, so we need to have you on there too. But then also political reporters, activists, lawyers, people who are just about to blow up and become really big, people that, like in Taibbi's case, I grew up reading. So that type of thing, that type of range.
What is your reading regimen?
That's a good question.
I have a theory that you're more scattershot, that you spend all day reading, but you're of a generation where it isn't regimented. Because you're, what, 30?
I'm not 35. But
you're 35. I would assume you go wherever your mind takes you without feeling that you have to read this magazine and this newspaper and this book.
That's true. And I did, I was kind of like hippie homeschooled, which meant that I basically had, very little structure. And I definitely spent a lot of time high school age and before I went to college just devouring books. And I think that actually still really plays to my advantage. So I do have this base of reading really widely, and I did read a lot of politics and history and but also philosophy and comparative religion. And then I went to Bates, which is, it's a good school, I have to admit. And
did you get a master's from Bates?
No, I only have a BA.
You didn't get a master's
I got
from
into
Bates?
Masters. I never went to a master's. No.
You still want me on your show?
Yeah, now I really want you on my
Magna
show.
cum laude. You really think I'm in the same league as the guys you have on your show?
See, this is the thing that I always wonder about, because every time I come on your show, I'm totally honored, and I totally appreciate all the words, and you say all these things about watching and listening to me, but then you make a joke like that and say that I wouldn't like it, and I'm like, yeah, you're really watching?
So, do you have this nagging feeling that if you don't hit certain benchmarks each day, you're falling behind in terms of your reading?
I have to say, as far as the kind of, while I don't have a specific routine like that, as far as the sort of magazine, newspaper, day in and day out reading, I hit some benchmark just by definition because it's my job.
And what are
like
they?
Every day I'm reading a news packet.
You do read a news packet?
Yeah, but I guess it's like, I don't know. What do I...
When you say news packet, is that prepared by your staff?
Yeah. We have a guy, Brendan, who does a great job basically sort of putting together packets for us, a Majority Report. So I should say I read that when I'm, main hosting, because I kind of, I'm sort of in the main chair once a week on Majority Report. But what is
the difference between a packet and just doing your own reading?
Well, I guess
fire Brendan.
For me,
fire him. You don't need him.
Brendan
has. Give me his number.
I have to say,
I'll let him go. I like
Brendan
to fire
has
people.
Made everything
Let's wait
so
till
much
Christmas,
more relaxing.
Let's wait till Christmas to fire.
Let's wait till Christmas. He's made everything so much better, I have to say, including a far less temperamental Sam, which I really appreciate. But what is the difference? Well, I think what it is it gives you, I like to go into, and my show is designed to do, pretty deep dives and to have content that lasts for a really long time. Now, the Majority Report, the interviews that we do, I would say, stay very evergreen, because we do these. The interviews are not news cycle dependent mostly. But then, on the other hand, the Majority Report's really like a daily news and analysis show. And so what the packet helps, at least me, when I'm hosting, just sort of like get a lay of the land. I know all of the big stories. I know the big sound and video clips. I can comment on them. And then I have time to dive deep into things that I'm going to be covering a lot more closely. So, if anything, the only thing that I actually really feel anxiety about or regret about with reading is I feel like I miss reading full books, and that's really the only thing. My news habits are they work for me. They're pretty far-reaching.
How do you determine?
I do a lot of international stuff. So I watch a lot of like Al Jazeera and France 24 and Real News Network, and then I follow a lot of specific columnists, like say Manti Eby.
How do you determine who's important? Because last night, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sometimes people just hang up in the middle of one of my interviews. They just stop. They don't even...
Who are these pricks you're dealing with?
They don't even bother to say goodbye. They just go, what? This is ridiculous.
Jesus. Horrible.
Last night, I was prepping for this. I did my colon cleanse. And, you're too young to know about prepping. So I thought I want to go into the underbelly of the right wing because I don't pay enough attention to what's going on with the Proud Boys and InfoWars and Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi. And I started going down that wormhole so I could talk to you about certain things, and I don't even know where to begin. How do you determine who's worth talking about when it comes to people like Gavin McInnes and Louder with Crowder? Do you feel like you're giving them unnecessary oxygen? Are they important? Mike Cernovich, all these people, are they worth talking about? Because I notice, I find out who the enemy is by watching you guys, because you're constantly going after Dave Rubin and all these right-wing crackpots. And I always think, well, should I be just watching the Majority Report and the Michael Brooks Show, or should I be paying attention to the Jordan Petersons? Where do you find them, the Milos? For me, they bubble to the surface when they're arrested in a men's room soliciting sex from a young boy. But you're down there, you're in the restroom with them.
Oh my gosh, that's a really horrifying image.
But you guys pay attention to these people. You pay attention.
Well, yeah,
to them.
we do,
How do you find them, through the Southern Poverty Law Center? Where do you find them? The Southern Poverty Law Center.
Well, I mean, some of them are. I mean, some of them are very specific to dealing with YouTube. So, Dave Rubin is a very big YouTube name and a facilitator of the far right. So I would put it into three categories. I mean, sometimes there's people like Dave Rubin who just have huge followings on YouTube, and they're spreading a lot of bullshit, and they're also very easy, and they're poisonous to the discourse. They also are very easily mockable personalities. So,
is there a ratings that we get from YouTube? Can we find out who the biggest stars are on YouTube when it comes to politics?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can look at people, how many subscribers people have. You can look at how many views their videos get. I mean, those are. I don't. There's definitely analytics on YouTube that are, for the creators and aren't publicly available. But views and subscriptions, you could see literally on the page. So people like Rubin. That's one thing. Then I think, I don't. Then the second category, I would say that I did a little bit of work in my 20s, freelance work like in brand strategy and trend watching. And sometimes, like with somebody like Jordan Peterson, I mean, he was already a name, but I remember starting to pay attention to him. And a few people being like, dude, why are you, I mean, sure, this guy's kind of a silly asshole, but like, who cares? Mm-hmm. And it was like, well, I think this guy's about to blow up. I think this guy's about to ride a serious wave and we should be on it. Mm-hmm. And, I was obviously right in that case. So, and then, the third thing, I don't know, I think part of the reason that, Gavin's obviously been creating more of a profile for himself, and there's been all that Proud Boy thing in Manhattan where they beat those protesters. But I think I think in Gavin's case specifically, I think part of what sort of makes him a target is he's this provocateur fascist, and then he is also of this culture. I think Sam used to know him, certainly has acquaintances that knew him. I know people who were, a couple degrees removed from him. Mm-hmm. Jamie, who's on our show, she had, he went after her years ago. So he's kind of like, he's sort of like the guy that you'd meet at some fucking Brooklyn party who's trying to start like a brown shirt organization. So I guess that's fascinating to people.
Is he really trying to start a brown shirt? Because he founded Vice. He must have made a lot of money. I know he just bought like a multi-million-dollar home in Larchmont. This is how I view these people, like Louder with Crowder. You know that guy?
Yeah, he's very dumb.
Okay.
Yeah.
Louder with Crowder, Gavin McInnes, and Anthony Cumia. They could not make it in mainstream comedy because they don't have the goods. They're just not smart enough. They can't sit in a room. They can't collaborate. They don't read enough. They live in the muck and the sewer of right-wing bullying. They add a couple of jokes that aren't even funny. but they're really failures as intellectuals and comedy writers and performers, and they know they are, so they blame their own inadequacies on the Hollywood, the show business elite. And then you have the Jerome Corsis who blame their own intellectual inadequacies on academia. So I always find them to be lightweights. Dave Rubin couldn't cut it on the Young Turks. Like Mike Cernovich, I know he's a lawyer, but when you watch his periscopes, you go, okay, I get it. This guy has some book learning, but there's some mental deficiency intellectually and psychologically. He's gone off the rails. Why listen to these?
Do you think that having a mental or intellectual deficiency is a barrier to having massive power and influence in the United States? I mean,
yeah, I do. I do.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I guess
I totally don't. I totally don't. I mean, I think these people, the ones you just mentioned, definitely, and I think in Steve Crowder's case especially, you're 100% right. And I think, he is absolutely just some type of failed comedian. But these people have massive followings. It's certainly like in Crowder's case, he gets Koch brothers funding, I believe. He's very connected to
who has Koch brothers funding?
Steve Crowder.
He gets Koch brothers
Steve
funding.
Crowder.
I thought so. I was wondering how it was possible for that show to be so well produced.
Yeah, I mean, he's done. There's a huge amount of numbers. I think, and in Gavin's case, here's what I would say. I actually would be more sort of with you of like, why feed this guy attention? Because he's basically, other than the sort of novelty of being like, oh, he found advice, now he's on the far right. Although, I don't think that that's actually that shocking. But I think that, this guy, first of all, his organization does show up at, far-right rallies across the country. It has actually really savagely beat and hurt people. One of these guys showed up at Vic Berger's front door after they were upset about him making a video making fun of Gavin. So it's a kind of, the other lesson I would say is, if I remember back in 2014, there was a guy named Matt Binder who used to be on the Majority Report. It used to be three of us, and that was how I started hosting. There would be M&M Mondays, and what was funny was, especially then, I think I've kind of filled out as a performer, but I did, it was like, okay, Michael does the interview, whatever, and I did, conversations on Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and, Israel, Palestine. I guess that's redundant. Israel, Palestine, and so on. And then Matt would cover all of these like men's rights activists and Gamergate and all of this weird shit. And I totally was sitting there, like, all right, that's okay. There's some guy on Reddit who, was a chronic masturbator. All right, I think I'll be getting to Yemen. Thank you.
Right.
And meanwhile, almost all of all of these figures are now like, I'm slightly exaggerating, but it's like now it's like, Boner 67 from Gamergate is a senior advisor to the Trump administration. Right. And all of these guys, actually turned out, to the extent you even took like the fake news stuff seriously, how much of a role that played in the election, I'm still kind of dubious about. But
let me ask you about that.
He was. I'm just saying, though, people like these guys were huge conduits for modern Republican politics.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mike Cernovich is from the guerrilla mindset. He started off hating women, and it came from the game, how to pick up women, how to get laid. And Gamergate was all about misogyny and being free to insult women while you're playing Call to Action or Call to Duty. Was the Republican Party smart enough to say, look, we can't tap into hatred for African Americans anymore? Where's the hate? You know what? there's a group of guys out there who hate women. They can't get laid. We can gather them up and bring them into our tent. Was there a conscious decision to gather up the misogynists and bring them into the Republican Party, or did they just find their way in there?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, look, the Republican Party is definitely the party of white identity politics, right? And obviously the Democratic Party has been this corporate neoliberal failure that's through basically having right-wing economic policies failed most of its constituencies, and that's a big part of the predicament we're in too. But that being said, yeah, I mean, Steve Bannon did seed Trump campaign people in video game forums and chat rooms. He was very aware of these things. And I think what also happened out of some of the sort of misogyny of those online subcultures is it actually mushroomed into hatred of Muslims and immigrants and black people. And a lot of like weird narratives of like who's getting the woman and who isn't, in ways that just started actually, on the internet and on social media, just replicating the oldest racism and paranoia and fears about basically white women and resentment and everything else. And I think if you combine that with, even for middle class and very privileged people, relatively speaking, still a lot of sense of stagnation in terms of mobility and opportunity, that's a recipe for far-right politics. And, that's the Republican Party.
Has the Republican Party morphed into a party that is misogynistic more than it's racist?
I just think it's the same thing. I think it's the same continuum. And I mean, I could hardly distinguish it, to be honest.
You told me that Dave Rubin was getting Koch brothers money.
Mm-hmm.
And Crowder is getting Koch brothers money now. I didn't know that. These are well-produced, good-looking shows. They'll preach the free market of ideas, but they're being subsidized. They're not really doing what you're doing, which is depending on an actual audience out there to cough up money. They're taking marching orders and money from the Koch brothers. Is that fair to say that they couldn't survive without right-wing money?
I don't know all of the specific numbers of these people, but I do know that. I know that Dave Rubin has definitely taken money from the Kochs. I'm 99% certain Steven Crowder has. I don't know what percentage of the budget it is, but I would say in general, look, if I was conservative, I would already have a show on Fox, or at least be a contributor.
Right.
And I'm not even joking, right? Like, I just think that if you have any talent and any ability, like on camera, and you're right wing, you're going to get funding, and probably even if you don't.
Rush Limbaugh takes talking points from the Koch brothers and reads them, and it's product placement. I didn't know this until recently. You can read a talking point for money on a show and blend it in the same way you're talking about Blue Apron. This is the problem with our First Amendment.
Yeah, I think it's also just the problem with the just complete domination of the oligarchy in American life, basically. And, that's what these shows are designed for. They are pure propaganda. And it's not, I would say there just isn't left propaganda in the same way. There might be sort of a lot of sort of democratic hackery. But one of the problems with sort of democratic hackery is the people in the center of the Democratic Party don't have a coherent, all-encompassing sort of ideology or philosophy to kind of push anyways. So on the right, you can do, it's free market mythology with misogyny, with partisanship, with conspiracy theories. And then in the sort of Democratic sort of media, it's a lot of just like, we hate Trump.
Right.
It's just not as coherent.
When you say hackery, you're talking about Orban in Hungary, people who work within a putative democratic system and present issues that are merely distractions that keep the left or the center confused while you're going around sub rosa stealing power and money and influence. And that's kind of what...
I was talking actually about like more like the Democrat media, like some stuff you might see on MSNBC. But I do think that, yeah, I mean, what's happening... Look, I think that there is obviously this broader rise of global far-right authoritarian politics. And you could see it in Hungary. You could see it obviously with Trump and the Republicans. You see it most certainly in Brazil and in India and Russia and in elements of the UK, right? I mean, this is in France, in elements of France. This is a global pattern. And, it seems that the sort of closest, that it's some combination of people returning to and wanting to have some extremely vicious, cruel, and exclusive attitudes and views, whether it's sexism or racism or xenophobia and so on. And it also correlates with this collapse, internationally of a sort of, of a global neoliberalism, basically, of sort of parties in the quote-unquote center, favoring corporations, workers losing their way, stagnation, inequality, corruption, all the rest of it. And, of course, these right-wing forces are actually, they're forces of capitalism, so they're only going to intensify those problems. But there's no doubt that part of their success is capitalizing off of that.
Aren't they successful because the right they're all ultimately on the same page? Money and power. They want money and power.
Yeah.
And everything else they use is a tool of distraction to keep our eye off their seizing of money and power. We really don't have honest interlocutors over at the Republican Party. We never really did have honest interlocutors. So they'll engage us on infrastructure projects and monetary policy and the veterans. But what they really care about is protecting big oil, big pharma, the big, powerful interests. They pretend to engage with us on women's issues, the plight of immigrants, but they don't care.
I think it's actually, in some ways I think it's even more pernicious than that, because the way I look at it is actually like this, which is there are actually, the Republican Party, yes, of course, ultimately the whole policy portfolio is built on giving money away to 1% and privatizing the commons and benefiting pharma and arms manufacturers and oil companies and so on. But then there's two things that I think make it more complicated. One, if we're being honest, a lot of Democrats are in the same boat, right? So, and it doesn't mean to say there isn't a real difference. There's of course, I voted for Hillary Clinton. I explained the difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump to people. But Hillary Clinton is a, creature of, corrupt capitalism and neoliberalism, and she certainly was not going to do anything about the arms or pharma industry or inequality or anything like that. We know this. So, and then on the other hand, too, I actually would say, no, there's a lot of Republicans that are quite interested in social and identity issues in the sense of making them worse and exploiting racial, racist attitudes and fears and lies to gin out a party of white identity politics. That's why you see things like lies about the caravan. So what you start to have then, and, we'll see how this plays out, although, I have a lot of skepticism about it, but, people like Schumer and Pelosi are, first of all, they're not left. They're certainly not left like I am, but they're not even left like, they're not liberal. They're not progressive. They're especially Schumer. They're really They're sort of functionary corporatists. Now, that's one thing, that's ideological. But even beyond that, they're not strategic. They don't know the fight they're in. They don't say, Chuck Schumer's still sort of playing these little minor games while Trump fills up the courts. While the Republican Party is waging full warfare with complete lack of interest in truth and institutions and all this stuff that sort of Democrats can get nerdy about. So I think what you have actually is you have like in Congress now, what you're going to have in the next session is you're going to have a totally uniform, hard far right that is, definitely, it's there to serve the Koch brothers. It's there to fill up the courts with extremists. It's there to do all of the, horrible things that we know Republicans do. That's their brand. That's who they are. And then some of them will occasionally pretend to be a little bit upset about something sexist the president said. And then others of them are going to be even further than the president, like a guy like Steve King, who's clearly a white nationalist. And then in the Democratic Party, you're going to have, it really is, it's a divided coalition party. You're going to have sort of, more sort of corporate-oriented suburban Democrats. You're going to have Nancy Pelosi being, I think, in some ways tactically smart, but very corporate-friendly and centrist. And then you have these new people coming in like Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and of course, obviously, Bernie Sanders is still the leader of this, who are, I would say they're social democrats. They do want single-payer health care. They do want, to actually do real things about the environment. They also want to actually address U.S. empire and foreign policy to some extent. And they're not on the same page. Those are serious differences inside the Democratic Party. Now, it doesn't mean, I'm not in this dumb false equivalency. I'll vote for, I would vote for any Democrat basically over any Republican, pretty much as a general rule, because the numbers matter and the center is better than, barbarism. Mm-hmm. But the center is partially what got us barbarism, and the center is definitely never going to solve our problems. So, that's the sort of terrain we're in right now.
That's why I think it's a waste of time to focus on Jim Acosta and his press credentials. I think CNN should just stop showing up at the White House press briefing and start covering what the administration is doing as opposed to what they're saying.
I agree with you. I think Acosta matters because of just sort of broader authoritarian war on the press, but that big picture, I completely agree with you. And then the other major question for Sarah Huckabee Sanders would be, what are you looking at? No, I'm sorry.
What are you looking at?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I made a very bad joke because of her eye.
Oh, I see.
So if she was in studio, I'd say, what are you looking at, Sarah?
I see. Well, very quickly,
Jesus, David.
Jeff.
Yeah, I am so fucking generous to you with your jokes. How dare you?
I'm threatened by you. I'm threatened by you.
I'm so generous. You leave me hanging. You leave me in the wind.
Lula.
Yes.
Why is he a cautionary tale? Who's he serving? The new president. Barcelona.
Bolsonaro?
Yeah.
Well, okay. I just want to say, please, in the last minute here, everybody look up Lula. I really would, certainly, I've done a significant amount of coverage on it, but I would also read Brazil Wire as a great resource. Lula da Silva is absolutely a political prisoner. The charges that he was convicted on were shockingly flimsy. Getting convicted of accepting an apartment which there's no physical evidence that he was ever even inside of, let alone having a deed or title on. And, he led the presidential race. He's this legendary figure in Brazilian history. He lifted between 20 and 30 million people out of poverty, and they suppressed him. And now Brazil has elected really like an actual fascist. Even people who are really kind of like nerdy about that term would accept it. He comes from the Brazilian military. Remember, the Brazilian military dictatorship only ended in the mid-'80s, and in a kind of tragic irony, Lula was a labor leader who went to prison and was a key figure in ending the dictatorship in the '80s.
As was Rousseff, his vice president, who was impeached.
Rousseff was a guerrilla fighter, and her impeachment was absolutely a coup, and she wasn't even charged with corruption. They impeached her on literally an accounting practice, and that's literal. So what you saw, though, with the rise of Bolsonaro, and now there's been more sort of public acknowledgement of it. So the prosecutor that targeted and viciously obsessed on Lula, first of all, there's a weird thing in Brazil. He's Lula's prosecutor and judge, because it's a rule that goes back to the Inquisition, which Brazil hasn't reformed, where somebody can actually play both roles, which is kind of stunning. But in addition to that, he got all this, and he was backed by the United States Justice Department, and there are some very, I think, important questions to ask about the role of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. oil interests in this. But he, got this total pass in U.S. media. He's this nonpartisan guy. He just wants to fight corruption. Well, he's taken a job as justice minister with the fascist Bolsonaro. So basically what you had is actually a guy keeping his main opponent silenced and in jail, and now getting a political job. A Brazilian general has admitted in a recent interview that they essentially threatened the Supreme Court in the middle of a campaign against releasing Lula. So there's sort of hints of coups in the air. And, look, Bolsonaro, everybody, the top lines are the just absolutely disgusting and horrifying comments he's made about basically everybody, right? Like Afro-Brazilians, gay people, and his son has talked about eliminating all communists in the country like they did in Indonesia, if you know history.
Didn't he dismiss Rousseff's time in prison the way Trump dismissed McCain's time in prison?
Oh, no, way worse than McCain. Way worse than McCain. What he did was he dedicated his impeachment vote of her to the general who tortured her.
Yeah.
Way worse. So he, but on the other hand, he received the backing of the Wall Street Journal, which of course, backed Pinochet and backed the brown shirts, and a huge amount of enthusiasm from the United States and Canadian corporations. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation even tweeted something out on the day he won, like, in spite of shocking comments, Canadian businesses see great opportunities in Bolsonaro.
Wow.
And so he's said, essentially that all indigenous areas of the Amazon, they need to be logged and gotten rid of, which is, of course, a huge human rights abuse, but also, the reality is that they didn't do a great job, but the Workers' Party governments of Dilma and Rousseff, of Lula and Dilma, actually did protect the Amazon to some extent. That has, global implications because of the role of the Amazon in climate change. So basically, and I think what you have now that's happening in the last couple of days is that the whole establishment in Brazil, which has absolutely, through a process of their own corruption, I just think, frankly, massive jealousy of Lula. I do think that that's part of it. I think the fact that a guy who's, not even high school educated, who grew up illiterate and worked his way up as a metal worker is better than they are, smarter, more strategic, a historical figure. I think people like Sergio Moro, this prosecutor, were seething with resentment for that. They went on board with this fascist adventure, as Lula called it in his last letter that he was allowed to release from prison the day before the election. And they, now they're kind of signaling to him, like, hey, tone it down on the genocide and mass murder talk, because we have real stuff to do, like getting rid of labor rights and austerity and handing away our natural resources to U.S. and Canadian corporations. But right now, it really kind of looks very much like something out of the 70s or 80s, where the United States is backing, a brutal authoritarian who's promising to mass murder people. And then in turn, he's just going to give away the store. In obviously ways that will, things like under Lula, hunger was basically eliminated in Brazil. Now it's back. They've been already under Michel Temer, who's the current very corrupt president who stabbed Dilma in the back in the impeachment. he was her vice president, and he's been implementing austerity. So a lot of these problems the Workers' Party had actually even eliminated are becoming things again in Brazil. And not only will Bolsonaro promises to accelerate that, they're, trying to implement even, they want to deregulate guns so people can carry guns in the street. There's probably NRA money there. And they want, in a country where there already is a major problem of police murdering people in favelas, as an example, they want to, one lawmaker in Bolsonaro's party was proposing that, what they should just allow is cops to set up sniper points on roofs and just shoot, petty drug dealers on the street without any investigation or recourse. So it's very analogous, actually, to the Philippines and a literal continuity of, and Glenn Greenwald, I think, is actually right about this. He said, and I disagree with him in some ways about how, I think you can call Trump a fascist, and I have no problem with that. But one real difference here is that, Bolsonaro literally was an army captain when Brazil was run by the military. And you have people that are still alive that were part of this regime that, they killed several hundred, they killed a lot of people. One of the things that Bolsonaro said is that the problem that the military did was they tortured too many people and they didn't kill enough people. So this is who the Wall Street Journal endorsed. This is who has U.S. Corporate backing, and this is who's taking aim at Brazil. And I do think, all polls, granted they were early polls, maybe things would have shifted. There was a lot of propaganda. There was a lot of threats from the military. But Lula, even though he had been, crucified in this political witch hunt, he still led Bolsonaro by double digits. And I do think he would have won and saved Brazilian democracy.
Wow.
And so, I hope people will still, speak out generally on Brazil and also still recognize that, Lula is a political prisoner and we need to talk about it. Bernie's talked about Lula, which is great.
Well, I am honored to talk to you. You're amazing. You really are. Michael Brooks hosts The Michael Brooks Show, which you should watch every Tuesday night on YouTube. You should also listen to The Majority Report, and you should become a Patreon supporter of The Michael Brooks Show by going to patreon.com/TMBS. That stands for The Michael Brooks Show. Go see him live at the Bell House in Brooklyn, February 1st. Who's on the show? Who are your guests?
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I hope you come, David. We have, me and Matt Leck and David Griscom, the guys who make up the team, and then Alona Minkowski, who's crew on the show. She's a regular. You've seen her host on HuffPost Live. You see her on MSNBC. She's great. Bhaskar Sunkara, the founder of Jacobin Magazine, is going to be there. And Trevor Beaulieu hosts a great podcast called Champagne Sharks and is another regular. All three of those people are regulars on Michael Brooks' show, and they're going to be there.
Fantastic. Michael Brooks, I will talk to you on The Majority Report this Friday.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Honor and a privilege. Thanks, David.
Yes, it is. It is an honor and a privilege for you. Congratulations on being asked back to my show.